Hello, my name's Adrian Goldberg and welcome to the Byline podcast. From the Byline Times, it's what the papers don't say, what radio doesn't report and what telly doesn't tell you. This time, Georgia on our mind. The former Soviet state has been rocked by protests outside parliament in the capital Tbilisi over a proposed law which critics say is a cover for increasing Russia's hold on the country. Russia already occupies around 20% of Georgian territory following its invasion in 2008. And the ruling Georgian Dream party is now trying to force media outlets and non-governmental organisations who receive more than 20% of their funding from abroad to register as, and I quote, an organisation serving the interests of a foreign power. UK Foreign Secretary David Cameron says the legislation is Kremlin-inspired, a view backed by an estimated 200,000 demonstrators who have faced riot police using tear gas, stun grenades and water cannon. Georgia only secured its independence after the fall of the Berlin Wall. An opinion poll suggests around 80% of the population is in favour of joining the European Union. But the EU says if this law is passed, there is no hope of that. Let's speak to Alex Scrivener. He's the Executive Director of the Democratic Security Institute, a pro-democracy think tank based in Tbilisi. Alex, welcome. Just tell me a little bit about your think tank, because you are one of the foreign-funded organisations which this law would presumably outlaw.
Well, firstly, to correct you, it wouldn't be technically outlawed by this law. This is just the first step on what we fear is going to be a chain of events that may lead to us no longer being able to operate in this country. Our organisation would come under the law because we are, like every other civil society organisation in Georgia, we do receive grant funding from abroad. And I say more or less every other because I think it's about 95% of charities, non-profit organisations receive money from abroad because Georgia's a small country and it's a poor country. So we are dependent, unfortunately, on help from abroad. So it's basically casting and labelling a huge group of people, some of which don't have much to do with politics at all. For example, some non-governmental organisations here work on healthcare or bringing treatments to vulnerable women or refugees. And those sort of organisations will also be cast as effectively foreign agents. And it's not just insulting, but it's also dangerous because it's the first step towards repression and oppression, which is what we've seen when similar laws like this were passed in Russia and other countries.
So the law then would force you, to register, to indicate that you are foreign funded? Would it have any direct impact on what you do and the spreading of your message?
This is what's so insidious about the law. So, the government claim, it's just about transparency. You just need to declare that you're funded from abroad. Well, that's exactly where the Russian legislation began. They said, it's no problem. Just say that you're a foreign agent and you're a vector for foreign influence, which effectively is forcing you to say that actually, we're not here and doing our work in the interests of the Georgian people. We're actually effectively foreign spies doing the bidding of some shady foreign benefactor, which is not reflective of the truth at all. I mean, it's a lie. We are funded. My organisation is funded primarily by the US National Endowment for Democracy. Those funders don't get a say in what our opinions are and what we do, in the sense that we apply for grants and we get them or not, depending on whether grant funders like what we're trying to do on the ground. But all of us are here for the interest of Georgia. We're not doing the bidding of a foreign power. And I think it's the intimation there that we will be labelled as effectively foreign spies that is the stage one of repression here. Because after that, if there's a small mistake in your registration or if you don't register the correct way, the government can then come in, inspect, impose huge fines, even for a first offence, which would effectively close down organisations. So there are tools there in the legislation that would effectively allow them to close whichever organisation that they decide is not in their interest to operate. And we've seen from the way the government is acting is that they will just invent pretexts to harass people they don't think are in their interests. So there is no trust in the government on this. And this legislation, we've seen it happen before in Russia, we've seen it in other countries across the region, is just the thin end of the wedge.
So you would see it then effectively as an extension of Russian influence within Georgia, a country which historically had been independent, albeit for a relatively brief period, but which was then brought within the orbit of the Soviet Union. You'd see this perhaps as an attempt by supporters or sympathizers of Russia to bring Georgia back within the orbit of Moscow?
The story of Georgia for the last 200, 250 years has been a story of struggle against colonization from Russia. The Georgian national story is one of resistance, and Georgia has been independent consistently since 1991. And in that time, has looked to the EU and Europe and democracy as a counterbalance to Russia, and has stood their ground on that, even as Russia invaded in 2008, and even as Russia is currently invading our neighbor in Ukraine. What this is, when 80% of the population want that kind of future, want a democratic future, want a future within the European Union, is effectively a sort of constitutional coup, because the Georgian constitution actually says that Georgia has to be oriented towards EU membership. So what the current government is doing by specifically passing a law that is incompatible with EU membership, EU states and EU officials have said, if you pass this law, you can't join. Effectively, they're sabotaging our way to Europe. And of course, if we're not in the European Union, well, then what's the obvious alternative? We're going to fall under the orbit of an authoritarian, dictatorial, imperialist Russia.
What I don't understand then is if the population is, according to polls that I've read, 80% pro-EU, and that is written into the constitution, then how can it have democratically elected the Georgian Dream Party, which seeks to undermine that?
Well, this is the thing. This government was elected in 2020. At that time, it was led by a man called Georgi Gakharia, who was then the prime minister, who promised EU integration as part of the mandate. And they were elected on the mandate of bringing Georgia closer to the EU. And over the previous 8 years they've been in power, they had, in some ways, delivered on that. You know, Georgians got visa-free travel to most of the European Union. Georgia, just last year, got EU candidate status to sort of confirm that we were on the way to winning membership. What has happened is Georgi Gakharia, the man who won the election in 2020, is now in opposition. He resigned over a matter of principle because he was instructed by the shady billionaire benefactor of the ruling Georgian Dream Party to arrest one of the senior members of the opposition. And he resigned saying, I'm not going to do that, and joined the opposition. So since then, the party has fallen into the hands of a small group of people who are linked to this billionaire called Bidzina Ivanishvili, who's a sort of benefactor and founder of Georgian Dream, who I think a lot of us suspect is now in cahoots with Russia to some extent to cement his place in power and effectively sabotage Georgia's route into the European Union. Now, why are they doing that? It's not because either Bidzina Ivanishvili or the Georgian Dream Party particularly love Russia. I mean, very few Georgians actually love Russia. Modern Georgian identity, anyway, is built around resistance to Russian colonialism. What's happened is basically Georgian Dream fears losing power. And while they could democratically hold on to power for the first 12 years they were in power, they were happy with a pro-Western trajectory. Now, of course, the problem with democracy is occasionally you lose elections and lose power. And this billionaire is terrified that he might lose these elections and therefore realizes that a pro-EU course means he can't go down an authoritarian route. So now this whole U-turn is not because they love Russia, it's because they want to stay in power indefinitely and they want to undermine democracy. And of course, the only power that will accept Georgia that's not democratic is Russia. So it's not from a love or ideology, it's just from pragmatism. If you want to be a dictator, well, you can't do that if you're in the European Union.
And is there a fear then that if the tension escalates, that Russia might offer some kind of military support or backup to Georgian Dream?
Well, that's the fear that some of us have been sort of whispering in corridors and on the streets of Georgia over the last few weeks. But the Georgian Dream government obviously coming up with this egregiously unpopular policy. It's like the Conservative Party in the UK turning around and saying, we're going to implement Maoist communism, despite the fact you elected us in 2019 on this manifesto. I mean, whether you want Maoist communism or not, it's pretty clear that there's no mandate for that in the UK without an election. So the fact that they've done this bizarre U-turn and reintroduced this hugely unpopular legislation kind of suggests, well, if they're trying to lose the election. I mean, that's not what governments generally do when they're about to fight an election, which is going to be here in October. So the kind of questioning goes to, well, why are they doing this? Why are they sabotaging their own chances of winning the election fairly by doing something so unpopular? And the unfortunate answer that some of us are considering and fearing is that actually he's done a deal with Moscow, and then the Kremlin have told him, look, if you're really on our side and you want our support, you need to sabotage your ties with the West. You need to sabotage Georgia's EU membership bid. And if you do that successfully, then whatever protests happen in Georgia, however much you lose the election, we in our tanks, which are actually just based a few miles away from Tbilisi because 20% of the country is under Russian military control, we will send our tanks in, or well, maybe some softer method of intervention and help you out. And that's not a wild story at all. I mean, it's what happened in Kazakhstan. There was an uprising and a protest movement against Kazakhstan's authoritarian leader, Tokayev, a couple of years ago, and Russia did send in forces to back up the government. In Belarus, we had a similar scenario where the regime there wasn't as direct a military intervention there, but it was a huge crackdown, which was supported by Moscow. So it is a model. And I know a lot of people say, well, it's unlikely to happen. Well, we said that about the Ukraine war a couple of years ago. A lot of people were saying there's no way they'd do a full-scale invasion. So forgive me, I hope it doesn't happen. It's not necessarily a likely scenario, but it is a possible scenario that we will end up with some form of Russian intervention, whether soft, I mean, for sure we'll have a soft intervention or a hard intervention.
And 200,000 people last Saturday outside Parliament in Europe's Square, many of them draped in EU flags. Is there any hope of intervention to support the pro-EU tendency, as it were, of the people in Georgia?
Who would intervene? I mean, we, the people in Georgia, would have to do this ourselves. Our hope is that the elections are in October, and if the government doesn't stand down this legislation, that there will be a resolution at the ballot box. But Georgia has a history of having sometimes questionable elections. And if the government decides that they're going to resort to shenanigans to win those elections unfairly, either by direct fraud or by intimidation, then we're in a very difficult situation, a potential constitutional crisis. And that's just the sort of situation in which Russia might decide to intervene. And that's something the West really needs to be ready for and trying to prevent proactively.
What can the West do then? What can a country like the UK do? Because as I'm sure you'll appreciate, as someone who was born in the UK, albeit that you're now living in Georgia, there would be precious little appetite in the UK, I suspect, for backing Georgian independence militarily. So what can we do?
Well, firstly, I'm gratified to hear that David Cameron, the Foreign Secretary, has actually said something about Georgia, because the EU statements have been very clear and very strict and very unambiguous that Georgia wants to join the EU. It can't go along with this legislation. And several US institutions have made similarly strong statements. And the UK had until now been rather a laggard on this and been rather quieter. So I'm gratified the UK is at least saying something now on this. And I think the answer is the UK needs to have a values-based foreign policy. You may have been aware that David Cameron did a tour of Central Asia recently when he visited 5 countries, or 6 countries actually, Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan, Tajikistan, Uzbekistan and Turkmenistan, I think Mongolia as well. And all of those, apart from Mongolia, are autocracies. And Turkmenistan is one of the most repressive countries on earth. And sort of doing sort of fun photo opportunities with dictators is not really the values-based foreign policy that we need to see in the sort of leadership we need to see from the UK. We need a foreign policy based on principle. And that means speaking truth and standing up for human rights in countries that are both friendly and unfriendly. And in the context of Georgia, it means saying on no uncertain terms to the Georgian government that there will be no business as usual if they carry on with this repressive legislation. And that, like Georgian UK business links, Georgia UK trade, Georgia UK diplomatic ties will suffer if they go through with this. I'm not necessarily a big fan of David Cameron, but he did put it quite well himself back in 2008 when Russia first invaded Georgia. He said at the time, we need to ensure that Russian oligarch shoppers aren't marching through Selfridges while their tanks and army are marching through Georgia. And I thought that was actually quite a good soundbite. And it's the sort of language we need to dissuade the Georgian government from going down the road that it's going down. And yes, there are talk about sanctions on particular Georgian officials. Now, sanctioning the whole Georgian population would be counterproductive because the Georgian population is pretty much on side.
Yeah, I mean, one of the sad ironies of any sanctions, should they be introduced if the law is imposed, would be that ordinary people in Georgia, like yourself, would actually presumably be harmed by them.
Yes, that's why the sanctions would have to be designed. And sanctions are sometimes ineffective. You have to target them right, and timing has to be right. And so any sanctions would have to happen quickly and at least be threatened quickly, so the government here knows to change tack before it's too late, before they've doubled down too far. The government, to be fair, has already signaled that it's open to dialogue with foreign countries about the law. That seems to be an possible indication that the Georgian government could be coerced softly by both public opinion here and by pressure from abroad to step back from the brink. and they're looking for face-saving ways to do so. Now, I hope that's the case, but this could be just part of the game that they're playing. And in fact, they have no intention of stepping back.
Yeah, it's intriguing, isn't it, that I'm speaking to you from the UK, a country that you were born in and that you know very well, which voted to leave the EU. What is it about the European Union that Georgians see as so appealing? Is it simply that it is regarded as the opposite pole, as it were, to Soviet influence and control by Putin?
Yeah, it's quite funny, isn't it? I was born in the UK, but my family is half Georgian. So I spent a lot of time living here in Georgia and a lot of time living in the UK. So it's quite funny. In 2016, during the Brexit referendum, I was campaigning on the streets with Another Europe, which was the sort of alternative progressive Remain campaign, waving EU flags, trying desperately to keep the UK in the EU against a Putin-supported Brexit. And here I am in 2024, waving EU flags on the streets of Georgia, trying to get Georgia into the EU against the wishes of Putin again. But in terms of your question, in Georgia, yes, the EU membership orientation towards the West is absolutely the form of resistance against Russian colonization, for sure. Georgia sees it's a small country, a poor country in a region with very few friends. If you go too far south from here, you've hit Iran. We're in a sort of difficult neighborhood. And obviously, Russia is huge and could overpower us in a matter of weeks or days. So for Georgia, the EU represents a kind of hope that Georgia can maintain its independence in the face of Russian threat. So absolutely it is about that. But it's also about democracy and freedom. So it's not just about Russian colonization as a culture, but it's about what Russia currently represents, which is dictatorship, illiberal, authoritarian, far-right politics. And many Georgians, especially young Georgians, tend to be more liberal and progressive in their outlook, and they want to be part of a broader European project. They don't want authoritarian, they want democracy, and they want to be able to set their own path for their own country. I was actually on another interview opposite one of the government MPs here, and he was saying, well, for example, the sort of things legislation would stop is a bunch of activists managed to stop a big hydroelectric dam in Western Georgia a few years ago, and that's foreign interference. We needed that electricity. And what he forgot was actually the reason that that project didn't go through is because local people were opposed to it. It's called democracy. And I think democracy is what a lot of Georgians want, and it's what they see in the European Union.
Yeah, let me put that devil's advocate question to you, though, because here in the UK, we have no illusions on Byline about the malign influence of Putin and malign Russian influence and possible interference in the Brexit vote, for example, the EU referendum vote. But from the outside, you might say, well, look, a country that says we want to know who is attempting to wield influence in our own country, something that in Britain you might say, oh, well, bring it on. We want to know who the American billionaires are who are trying to buy influence in the UK. That might be helpful to voters to understand that. So what you seem to be saying is that there is a specific Georgian context to this, but the hard question is, well, in its own right, is that not a reasonable request from the Georgian government?
If this was really about transparency, I would be the first person to support this law. And the fact it's bad faith is the reason that none of us are in favour of it. In terms of transparency, the Georgian civil society sector is one of the most transparent in the world. Not just transparent, but we all advertise who funds us, because one of the realities of working in the sector, if anyone has ever worked for an NGO or a civil society charity in their lives will tell you, you actually want to advertise who funds you because you want other funders to see, oh, look, they're funding them as well. They must be reputable. So actually, it's in none of our interests to hide who fund us. And we all are quite public about it. And we submit all of this information to the tax authorities here in Georgia. So it's not exactly a secret at all. It's actually quite a transparent sector, one of the most transparent in Georgia, I would say. So it's actually not about that at all. They know who funds us, and we say who funds us. What this is about is control and intimidation. And the irony is that the actual agents of foreign interest, the people here who are being funded covertly by Russia, would not be affected by this legislation. Because if you're really a Russian spy or even a spy from anywhere else, you don't receive grants from transparent charitable organizations in European countries or America. You receive money in brown envelopes at the bottom of railway bridges. And that stuff doesn't get caught by this law at all. So it doesn't actually do anything to capture real espionage or any people really pursuing the interests of foreign countries. But it does catch a lot of people doing vital healthcare advocacy work in Georgia who happen to be supported from abroad. Sometimes not even anything to do with politics at all. So it's a very bad faith piece of legislation. And if you look in detail of it, if you make a mistake, the government pretends that you've made a mistake, which is more the reality here in your registration form, they can fine you an inordinate amount of money up front, which for a small charity or an NGO would bankrupt you straight away. So they can affect the closure of an organisation at will as a result of this legislation. So it's nothing to do with transparency at all. If it was, then I would be in favour of it.
Been really fascinating to speak to you. Thank you for your time, Alex. That's Alex Scrivener, the Executive Director of the Democratic Security Institute, which is a pro-democracy think tank based in Tbilisi in Georgia. Thank you for listening to this episode of the Byline podcast. I hope you find it as insightful as I have. And if you want to support our work, please consider taking out a subscription to the Byline Times. It's our brilliant monthly newspaper. It contains the best of our online content and articles that you won't read anywhere else. So do head over to bylinetimes.com to take out a subscription, and you'll not only get the brilliant Byline Times, our monthly newspaper, you'll be helping to support this podcast as well. This has been a We Bring audio production in Birmingham by me and Harvey White for the Byline Times. We'll see you again very soon. But for now, thank you and goodbye.